Hi students, welcome to this lecture specifically on the iconography of the Buddha. We'll get started with this image that I've placed on the screen already. This is, you might call it an aniconic image of the Buddha. So we'll talk about iconic images versus aniconic images in just a moment. But obviously this is not, an image of literal representation of the Buddha. Instead, we have a pillar with an animal on top of it. It's a lion. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But just to give you some background for this image, the very first Buddhist emperor, ruler of India, Emperor Ashoka, erected a bunch of these pillars at a bunch of important places in the Buddha's life around India, and this is one of them. So that's where this image comes from. So first, let's look at a little map, just for those of us who aren't as familiar with Southeast Asia. So you might have heard of New Delhi, India. We're actually going to focus more on the region that's close to Nepal and Pakistan today. We're going to look at a couple specific cities. So Sarnath, this is where the Buddha gave his very first sermon. And then, of course, up by Nepal, this area, in ancient India between Nepal and the Indian border. This is where the Buddha is from and where he basically attained his enlightenment. So we'll hang out around there, and then we'll talk about the area up here between the Pakistan and New Delhi border, and this is where some of the later images of Buddha came to be in the area that used to be called Mathura. So we'll hang out over there today as well. So for many of us, we might not know anything about Buddhism, so first we'll talk a little bit about this. The Buddha was not always the Buddha. He was a prince. You might have heard of Siddhartha Gautama. This was his name when he was royal. He was born in the 5th century before the Common Era, in this area that we just talked about between the North Indian border and South Nepal border. It was prophesied at his birth that he would be either a world ruler or an enlightened being. Obviously, he became an enlightened being. So he lived his full life until he was 29 in a life of luxury, living in a royal palace. But he decides at 29 to leave the palace and instead to kind of figure out what he wants in life because he's not feeling fulfilled. So he leaves and he sees, the prophecy goes, or the story goes, that he leaves and he sees an old man, a dying man, and a dead man. And he also meets an ascetic. That's the term you see here. This is a person who leaves their life in the city and actually pursues enlightenment in the wilderness and lives off the land and just kind of meditates. So he decided he wanted to do that as well. So he leaves his life at the palace and he decides to meditate for 6 years in the wilderness. And then at that point, 6 years later, he attains complete enlightenment. This is a state of infinite knowledge, and he becomes known at this point as the Buddha, or the enlightened one. And he attains enlightenment under under a fig tree that they call the Bodhi tree. And this place where he attained his enlightenment is therefore called the Bodh Gaya, the place Gaya of enlightenment, Bodh. So he becomes the Buddha and the enlightened one. And his first teachings are at Sarnath, and I already pointed that out on the map for you. At this point, he declares 4 noble truths as the foundation of Buddhism. So here are the 4 truths, and they're pretty obvious. Life is suffering. For those of you who've lived life, you know that there's a lot of suffering in life. It's not easy. But that this suffering, number 2, has a cause, and which is ignorance and desire. These are the things that we want, the things that we desire, and we are ignorant, basically. However, this ignorance, and this is the 3rd truth, and desire can be overcome. It can be extinguished if we attain enlightenment. So that leads us to the 4th truth, that you may overcome these things, ignorance and desire, if you follow an 8-fold path. Being the right of view, the right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So as long as you get, if you want to overcome these things that cause suffering, you will do these things in life and become enlightened as well as the Buddha did. So then we have kind of the image of Buddha himself. It's not always one that we see in the flesh, like you see here. It's important to understand the Buddha is not a god. He's one who sees the ultimate nature of the world. He's enlightened, but he's not a god. Because of his teachings, he understands that we no longer need to go through this cycle in Buddhist thought that we call samsara. This is the cycle of birth and life and rebirth. This understanding that in life we live, we are birthed, and then we have to go through life and then die, and then we are rebirthed. And this is a cycle that goes on forever. It's understood that the Buddha, in his attaining of enlightenment, he didn't have to go through this cycle of life. So there becomes two strands of Buddhism. One is the Theravada. This is self-cultivation for the purpose of attaining nirvana. This is the end of samsara. Nirvana is where we come to the end of this cyclical way of being and instead just become enlightened. And the second strand is Mahayana. This is compassion for all beings and the understanding that all beings should be able to attain that nirvana, the end to samsara, this cycle of life and death and rebirth. So we talked about this earlier. How do we see the imagery of the Buddha? This is really important as we talk about aniconic versus iconic imagery. So early images of the Buddha tend to be aniconic. The basic term, basic way to define aniconic is any time that we see symbolic representations of the Buddha as opposed to representations in human form. So as you see here, this is the image of the Buddha in human form. You see he is bodily, but prior to this, he was seen as aniconic. So basically symbols, and here's a variety of symbolic ways to represent the Buddha without putting him in human form. And we see this in a variety of other religions. In Judaism, we saw this. And even in Christianity, one of the commandments, of course, as we know, is tied to how we see imagery in terms of Islam, Judaism, and early Christianity. Is we have tied to one of the early commandments where we are not to make graven images of gods, right? And so many of you who know the Bible and know the commandments might know of that. And of course, this has led to a moment that we call iconoclasm, which we haven't gotten to yet in this class, where iconoclasts will try to break images of Christ. And so we'll get there later. The same happens for images of the Buddha in early Buddhism, where Buddhists believe that we should not have images, graven images of Buddha, because we don't want to worship those images. We want to worship the Buddha himself and learn from his teachings. So this is what we have in the early images of the Buddha as well. So instead of seeing the Buddha as a human, we see him as an empty throne, as a wheel which signifies his creation of the wheel of law or dharma. We see his footsteps, symbols of him, of his presence, but not of him. So footsteps. The stupa, I posted a video with this week's material on the great stupa at Sanchi. So please watch that to know more about the stupa. I will talk about it momentarily. It's basically a mound. Anytime that we see bulls, horses, lions, elephants, this can signify one of his early sermons. His early sermons were thought of as the lion's roar. So anytime we see a lion specifically, a parasol is also, typically used to shade royalty. So those are oftentimes seen as symbols of him. The lotus flower, which is a symbol of enlightenment. The lotus flower in Buddhist belief and also in Hindu belief is a flower that it grows out of the swamp, out of the murky dirt, right under the water, and then emerges out of the water as this beautiful flower. So all of these images have come to signify the Buddha without using the bodily form. So we see a few of these here. And why would this be? Well, this is the belief that the Buddha, it might be tied to the commandments, but we also have the belief that the Buddha may have lived 550 lifetimes and had achieved nirvana, or the liberation of from the cycle of that karmic kind of rebirth, death, rebirth, death, right? That he's free from that, and so that he's also free from human form at least at this early time, right? This is before the first century of the Common Era. So here we have images of the Buddha, the wheel, as we talked about, the lion on top of a pillar, and of course attendants who flank it. Here you also have that tree, which looks like I don't think that I have that in this list, but that should be on there. The tree under which he attained enlightenment, which is the fig tree, is also represented here. Okay, the sacred fig tree. And then of course the empty throne. We have attendants. Oh, we also have a parasol, kind of umbrella used to shade royalty, even though he's not here. Here you also have that fig tree as well, and then some footsteps. Okay. So again, we also see a variety of these capitals. This is by, again, the Anoshka emperor, Anoshka. So we have a variety of these Anoshkin pillars. Here's one at Sarnath. Again, these are at places that were important to the Buddha's life. And of course, we know Sarnath is the first site of his first sermon. So here we have these lions, and there's 3 of them. Here we see them. I'm sorry, 4, there would have been a 4th behind this one. And they do face the 4 cardinal directions, right? North, south, east, and west. And then we have the chariot wheel, once again, a symbol for the first sermon that we see pretty often. I'm not going to talk much about the stupa because I've posted a really great video about the stupa, but it's a religious monument. It's a solid mound, which usually is built around a relic. A relic, in this instance, would be a remains of a holy person. So the holy person here would be the Buddha. So the first stupas were created to house the remains of the Buddha after his cremation. And there were 8 portions of his body that were given to important kings, and then of course encased in these burial mounds that we call stupas. Early stupas were venerated by pilgrims, right? They were praised by pilgrims for their enlightened status, if people wanted to become enlightened as well. So here's the great stupa at Sanchi. Please do watch the video on that. And as you can see, it's just basically a mound, and the Buddha's remains would have been buried within, but you can't go inside of it because it is just a mound of dirt and rubble. But then on the face of it, it has dressed stone covered in a nice, shiny, beautiful plaster. And then 2 different areas you can walk around. Stone railings and paths. So the idea is that you would walk around these. This is called circumambulation. It's also a practice that is utilized in Christianity also, in which you kind of, and Islam actually for that, a way in which you kind of meditate and think about the sacred object that you were there to see and to be in the presence of by walking around it over and over and over again. So here are some pathways. And of course, the pathways are littered with later iconic imagery of the Buddha where you see him in his human form, which we'll talk about momentarily. So the Buddha is actually never shown in human form before the 1st century. So this is where we have all those aniconic, key term, aniconic imagery. And then later we do have the anthropomorphic imagery that ushers in this new phase of Buddhist art in which we see the Buddhist's body being depicted with specific marks. We call these lakshanas, and hand gestures, mudras. So we'll talk specifically about those in a moment as well. And this comes to the fore around the Kushana period. we talked about the Mathura kind of area, which is up in North India, kind of close to the Pakistan border. That area in ancient India would have been called kind of the Mathura area of India, the Mathura region. And there would have evolved this kind of series of representations of the Buddha that would have evolved from lakshas. These are male nature gods, which would have become, would have moved towards kind of this image of the Buddha himself. Because remember, when the Buddha was alive and hundreds of years after he died, we didn't even have images of him. So most of the images of the Buddha that we have are just kind of guessing what he would have looked like, probably based on these early nature gods as well. Here you have a mudra. There's a series of hand gestures that we call mudras. This one is the Bahaya Mudra, where you have him raising one hand. This is the mudra of blessing, reassurance that it's the Buddha, basically him telling us, have no fear, it is I, the Buddha. And you see these in a variety of images of him. He's also got a halo and 2 attendants. And then, of course, the sacred fig tree. This is, of course, the place, it's the place where he attained enlightenment under that fig tree after meditating for 6 years. There's an interest in abstraction, not realism necessarily. And then another term that we love, of course, that we've already talked about in terms of ancient art, and that's hierarchy of scale. Notice he's much larger than the lions, than his attendants. And that's not because the attendants were small people. It's just to emphasize that he is the most important figure. And of course, that means that his scale is rendered as larger. So we see him here in terms of hierarchy of scale. All right, so let's move on. Oh, to these attendants, just to talk about them for a few moments. It's possible and likely that these attendants might be, they could just be attendants, or they could be what we call bodhisattvas. Now, if you'll recall when we talked about the term bodhi, that is kind of enlightened is what that means, because we talked about the enlightened space, the enlightened tree, right? So the bodhi tree. So the bodhisattva is an enlightened being, a being who postpones their enlightenment in order to help others. And this comes from Western literature, where we see these figures. And the Buddha himself, in his early writings, talks about himself as a bodhisattva, as someone who wants to attain enlightenment. So there are a series of attendants and who, obviously are not enlightened, right? They still have marks of royalty and a worldly life, crowns and so forth, earrings. But they are beings who have postponed their enlightenment. And instead of becoming enlightened and escaping the cycle of samsara, they choose to stay on earth to help others who are suffering, help others to attain enlightenment, right? So they choose this longer course to perfect themselves as they move towards enlightenment, as they help others. So it's possible, and here's a couple paintings of bodhisattvas from other places in India. These are from the Ajanta caves in India, where you see specific images of bodhisattvas. Now, as we move on, we see the iconography of the Buddha become more specific. In the Kushana period, we have a more eclectic religious views in which we have the Buddha becoming more specific in his betrayal. And because of this, we have new innovative figural art emerges. So again, we still have the Gandhara region that is being emphasized here, but we have the use of the monk's robes, which of course we saw here with the Buddha as well. But here you have a slight contrapposto, and we talked about this term when we talked about that Roman art. And so these artists are looking to Roman style and using kind of that heavy drapery, which we see in the Hellenistic period of the ancient Roman art. And then we also see a slight contrapposto. Remember when we looked to the doryphorous figure, if we'll think to a couple lectures back, where you have that slight bend of the knee, you can see the Buddha's knee touching the drapery here, slight bend of one arm. This arm is missing, of course, but it would have been a little bit bent. So there's this relaxed a way of standing, which is very much like what we would have seen in the doryphorous, in that kind of invention, that Roman invention of the contrapposto, Roman and Greek invention, where you have the use of a naturalized body. We also have a broad athletic figure here, and then what we call lakshanas, and we'll talk specifically about these. There's 32 major distinctive marks that we see on the Buddha that tell us this is indeed the Buddha. This is not just a bodhisattva or a different figure. This is the Buddha. So here are a few of them that are probably most important that you might want to memorize. Any symbol of radiance. So here, you know, obviously there's no paint here, but he might have been painted gold. Obviously that paint has worn away over time, but a golden body, a halo around the head. We see this with other Buddhas, like this one, for instance, right? A flame around the head sometimes is seen as a symbol. Superhuman physical characteristics. So he's got a large body. He's got super long arms. Like his hand goes all the way down to his knee. Those are very long arms. And look at how long his fingers are, right? His thumb is super long as well. So that can be one of the lakshanas. The chakras, a wheel impression on the hands or feet. The urna, this is the mark between the eyes. You see this often, a red mark or a jewel or a ruby between the eyes. This is the site of his enlightenment, his third eye, okay? Elongated earlobes. You see these often as well. Now, this is a reference to his elegant life before he attained enlightenment, because remember, he was a prince for 29 years. And so princes would wear very heavy earrings and very heavy jewelry. And the jewelry would have been so heavy that it would have elongated his earlobes. And this would have been a sign of elegance and wealth, right? That you would have been able to wear and purchase big, probably jade earrings that would have elongated one's earlobes. So those are still there, even though he's given up that life. The Ushnisha, another super important signifier of the Buddha, that is this protuberance on top of his head. It looks like a man bun for those of us who have seen that kind of trend recently in male fashion, where you have guys with long hair having a nice little bun on top of their head, a top knot, okay? This is not the Buddha trying to be fashionable, right? This is actually a protuberance, a piece of flesh on top of his head that houses extra brain, because when he was enlightened, his brain grew and he needed extra room on the top of his head for that extra brain. So now we have what we call the Ushnisha, which is a perfect, major, distinct mark of his godliness as the Buddha, his holiness as the Buddha. So just to kind of give you a look at where we really see that heavy drapery coming in as something that is tied to Roman and Greco traditions and the contrapposto. Here you have this perfect comparison between a Buddha from the Gandhara period. Again, he does have the halo, the contrapposto with the bent knee, the slight kind of shift of the weight to one side of the body, next to a Roman marble statue from the Hellenistic period. And now I want us to look for some of these lakshanas. Remember, what are they? Well, you probably see right away the Ushnisha, right? That top knot, that little man bun, you might say, or protuberance on the top of the head, which allows extra room for extra brain after the Buddha attained enlightenment. The urna, that's right now, of course, very easy to see on all three of these Buddhas. That's that third eye center. That's that spot right between the eyes of enlightenment. The elongated earlobes, you see that with these two specifically, where there would have been those heavy earrings. The attendants who flank him, right? The throne itself, he sits on the throne. He's got the monk's robe and all of these. What else? Oh, the chakras. So if you could see closely here, there is a wheel on his hand, which is of course giving us that mudra that also signifies him as the Buddha, that he's saying this is the specific hand gesture that tells you that I'm blessing you, not to fear me, right? And that I'm the Buddha, I'm here. So we see that as well. And on his hand, you see the wheel, of course, that aniconic image mixed with the iconic image of the Buddha, because we know the wheel, of course, is tied to his first sermon and his putting the wheel of law into motion there. You probably are seeing others. We have the halo behind him. Again, the Bodhi tree, that sacred fig tree under which he attained enlightenment. And I'll stop there, but there's lots to see here. Anytime you see images of the Buddha, you'll be able to see these specific lakshanas, which signify that it is indeed the Buddha. And that's all I wanted to share today for this short lecture. Have a great week, and let me know if you have any questions.